for having me tonight. My name is Michael McGrath, organizer with Sierra Club Florida. Really tonight's presentation really will be a conversation, right? I think this political cartoon kind of sums up a lot of something that a lot of us feel sometimes whenever these harmful algae blooms, whether they be blue-green algae or red tide or what have you, right? Affect our coastlines and really quality of life. And we're all just kind of thinking, oh my gosh, is this gonna be another summer of slime for ourselves? And that's really what we've been seeing throughout this summer as well in parts of Tampa Bay and also south there as well. So before we get into things, I just wanted to offer just kind of a moment of silence for the dead and dying, really paying homage to Florida's imperiled and also overpolluted water bodies. I'm going to show a brief montage of images that show various instances of harmful algae blooms to our treasured waterways, and just to provide some more context to the scope and also severity of Florida's water crisis. Oops, there we go. So before we go any further, I would love to just kind of hear from folks about what you know about harmful algae blooms in Florida, whether it be blue-green algae or red tide. Just kind of want to just kind of take a general pulse, what folks have heard, and also just kind of just hear what people are wondering about these various algae blooms here in Florida. So if folks want to come off mute, they can share that way. If they also want to type their questions into the chat, they can do that as well.
Hey, this is Ann Doran, and for a while, hang on, let me mute.
No worries.
For a while, I lived in Galveston. I actually lived on Tiki Island, and we had this quite often on the other side of the Gulf, and it would always come with the seagrass as well. And I notice it comes independently of the big seagrass washing up here, but I also found that in Galveston, you couldn't walk on the beach. People were really uncomfortable. Whereas here, it was only those of us with respiratory distress in 2018 who seemed to have problems. So is there a difference between the West Coast and the East Coast of the Gulf?
That's a great question, actually. And I have family who lives over on the West Coast of the Gulf in Corpus Christi, actually. Spent a lot of Easters there over the years, actually. And I've seen, red tide in the West Coast of the Gulf in Texas, just like you see here on, on the East Coast of the Gulf here in Florida. It's the same organism of Correnia brevis. And, those blooms are present, throughout the Gulf. They do appear most predominantly in Florida and also followed by Texas. But you will see them sometimes in Alabama and also Mississippi and Louisiana as well, but just not as often though, just due to currents, the way that the Gulf works and whatnot. But yeah, it is the same bloom. That's interesting that you mentioned that oftentimes we'll have seagrasses washing up on the shores in Galveston, but you won't see that as much here in Florida. But yeah, they're the same organism though.
This is Barbara. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So growing up in Charlotte County, I've been going to the beach obviously my entire life, and I know that there was always a little red tide here and there, and over the years it would be, worse than others, and then obviously in recent years it's been really, really bad. But I don't recall hearing blue-green algae when I was young, you know, as a teenager in high school, going to the beach to play volleyball in Inglewood. I just don't remember that. Maybe it just wasn't clicking, or was it really prominent back then like it is now, and I just didn't really understand? Or is it something relatively new in you know, in the world of water issues themselves?
Yeah, I think what we've seen actually over the last 30 years actually is there has been an uptick in actually the incidence of harmful algae blooms here in Florida. You know, blue-green algae has been around for a long time, just like, you know, Brevis has been around for a long time. But these algae blooms are occurring at a greater frequency and also intensity than before, because there's more nutrients within the water, be it phosphorus or nitrogen, that is fueling these algae blooms. So, and also, you know, when you have an algae event like we had in 2018, there's more and more media coverage around it that is getting more coverage, and, you know, environmental groups across, you know, the state have been raising alarm on these issues for, you know, decades now, because they are becoming of increased concern because of the overpollution to Florida's waterways. But yeah, that's really interesting to hear that, you know, you feel like that there's maybe there's more press coverage of it today than there was previously. Maybe someone else, I guess, maybe one other thought or question folks might have. No? Okay, no worries. Well, yeah, anyway, so, you know, one thing I will kind of, you know, hint at, right, is that, you know, both blue-green algae and also red tide, you know, thrive in warm, nutrient-rich water. Blue-green algae is mostly confined to freshwater and also brackish waters, while red tide, you'll oftentimes see it in, well, almost exclusively see it actually in marine waters. You know, marine red tide is actually is a single-celled organism called Brevis. It's a dinoflagellate, and the blooms typically occur offshore, where land-based nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus can help feed the algae. And over the last 30 years, we can unequivocally say that red tide blooms have been increasing in scope and also intensity here in the Gulf. You know, the same can be said also for blue-green algae. You know, there's public health concerns for both of these harmful algae blooms. You know, blue-green algae has cyanotoxins and also most notably microcystins, which can damage the liver, as well as it also produces an amino acid called BMAA, and don't ask me pronounce how that's pronounced scientifically, because I just can't say it entirely very well. But this BMAA amino acid actually, when ingested or consumed, can actually lead to various neurodegenerative diseases such as ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. You know, also, meanwhile, another person was mentioning on today's call that, you know, red tide really does emit these different brevotoxins, right? Which can be deadly to many sea animals such as dolphins, manatees, fish, sea turtles, sharks, etc. Right? That, you know, then will become washed up on our shores, and they can also cause acute respiratory symptoms in humans as well. You know, which has a lot of public health concerns due to the irritation that can cause to our eyes, nose, throats, and lungs. And, you know, they can really exacerbate underlying respiratory distresses such as bronchitis, asthma, or what have you. And, you know, anytime we see a really huge red tide bloom, we always see documented cases of an uptick in folks going to the emergency room or going to receive medical attention for respiratory distress. And the same can be said also for gastrointestinal disorders as well, because, you know, these red tides can also have you know, a serious impact on the marine food chain, contributing to shellfish poisoning and also gastrointestinal disorders, and we'll see that affect you know, the population surrounding areas as well. There's one thing that I think I want folks to kind of remember from tonight's presentation. It's that Brevis is a really good eater. So it's a mixotroph, meaning that it eats like a plant and also eats like an animal. So it can take advantage of different food sources, and fuel comes from many different sources. So Florida land pollution, you know, just like other algae, atmospheric pollution, climate change, greenhouse gases, land-based pollution that travels from elsewhere in the Gulf, smaller organisms that feed directly on land-based or atmospheric pollution, riverborne blue-green algae that dies once it hits salt water, and also even iron-rich African dust. So it can actually utilize 12 different forms of nutrients, and also, like I said, consume other single-celled organisms for food. So, really these harmful algae blooms are bad for the economy and they're bad for taxpayers, right? In Florida, the environment is the economy. Our quality of life depends on, having good, clean water. And, when our coasts and also our springs and rivers and lakes suffer from these algae blooms, it affects our economy. There's actually a recently released University of Florida IFAS report that indicated the 2017 to 2019 red tide bloom that created over $180 million in lost revenues for various industries such as charter boats, marine recreation, or Airbnb and hotel reservations across Southwest Florida, looking at communities from Tampa Bay all the way down to Naples. And this entire ecotourism industry and outdoor activities is really a multi-billion-dollar industry in Florida, every single year. And if we continue to have these red tide blooms and also these blue-green algae blooms and other harmful algae blooms, it's going to really impact our state's economy. Our state coffers come, most of the general revenue from there comes from sales taxes. And if people are spending less money from our tourism-related activities, there's going to be less money flowing in our economy and also less revenue streams for sales taxes, which will ultimately end up impacting government programmings, leading to even more budget cuts, across the board. So we throw around these terms a lot, nitrogen, also phosphorus. There's a lot of questions around that, but oftentimes people wonder, how does nitrogen and phosphorus get into our waterways, right? So basically, when you think about a water basin, essentially is a watershed, right? And just like in a bathroom sink, everything that falls into the basin ends up in the same place. Essentially, a general area of land is where all the water that drains off goes in the same place into some sort of receiving water body, be it a river, a stream, a lake, or the ocean. And these nutrient pollution, these nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, are carried from stormwater runoff into these receiving water bodies where they'll fuel algae blooms. And we're going to explore some of the sources of pollution in a moment here. But I think this is good to provide some more context as well as far as what is our water basin that we're experiencing here within our neck of the woods, and a lot of it has to do with the Greater Everglades ecosystem. And one book I recommend reading if you really want to get the full gory, bloody story on on the various engineering projects that have been done to the Greater Everglades ecosystem that have affected the hydrology and also the current flows. It would be to read The Swamp by Michael Grunwald. But here on the left-hand side, you can kind of see a map that looks at the historic flow of the Everglades. And on the right-hand side, you can see what the current flow looks at, right? And as you can see that the Army Corps of Engineers has done a lot to manipulate this ecosystem for various flood control projects to accommodate Florida's development and booming population growth over the last century or so. Water within the historic Everglades used to begin just south of Orlando over in Shingle Creek. That's generally considered to be the most northernmost headwaters of the Everglades, and then proceeds slowly to flow into the Kissimmee River, the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes, and before eventually made its way into Lake Okeechobee. And that's part of the reason why Lake Okeechobee is often called the liquid heart of the Everglades. And because historically the water would spill over that southern lip and then would slowly trickle down through the Everglades river grass during the wet season, helping to replenish the ecosystem. That is until there's a series of projects that were done in the Everglades to quote unquote reclaim the land so that can be used for development and also agricultural purposes. These various flood control projects really have altered the entire historic flow of the Everglades and have caused immense harm to these ecosystems, causing basically, the engineering projects to be done where we created these unnatural and artificial flows that have connected the Caloosahatchee and also St. Lucie River to the west and east coast, respectively. Part of the reason why these alterations were done was so that way we could actually have more flood control for communities and also agricultural operations south of the lake over in the Everglades agricultural area after a tremendous storm back in the 1920s really flooded and also drowned a lot of communities there. So they helped create the Herbert Hoover Dike to prevent those sorts of disastrous floodings from occurring in the future. But now as a result of that, the dike can only take a certain volume of water before it becomes structurally unsound, and the Corps has to convey most of that water either to the west or east coast, causing these devastating harmful algae blooms, which fuels red tide and also blue-green algae. And really, that's really what's devastating many of our estuaries and also local economies as a result. But contained within that entire water basin and also in that watershed is a variety of sources of nutrient pollution. Sewage is one of those examples. You can have it coming from some sort of sewer line, leaky sewer line, to a leaky wastewater treatment facility. That might have some faultiness to it whenever there's high rain events, where it'll actually discharge pollution into receiving water bodies in the area. You also see it within leaky septic tanks as well. Another source of pollution that's oftentimes overlooked actually is biosolids. I'm not sure if folks have ever heard of biosolids before, but essentially biosolids is sewage sludge that is a product of the wastewater treatment process, where basically the liquids are separated from the solids, and it creates this nutrient-rich product that is disposed of via land application. It's usually dumped and also spread on agricultural sites. And here in Florida, it's actually done north of Lake Okeechobee, as the Florida legislature, which created a law back in 2007 that said that the distribution of South Florida biosolids need to be done areas north of the lake. So now we're having this brewing sewage crisis on our hands, in which North Florida unfortunately has to take South Florida's crap and also has to bear much of the environmental damage, public health, and also economic burdens that are being forced upon from North Florida. And overall, this contamination of sewage into our waterways really creates a situation where we're having excess nutrient pollution, but also fecal matter bacteria as well. That's also creates these public health concerns for our residents, as we can see in the bottom right-hand corner. I'm just saying that you be careful not to swim, fish in this area, as surface waters have been contaminated with fecal matter bacteria. Fertilizer is another pretty big source of nutrient pollution here in Florida. We have a lot of our industrial farming operations and also residential fertilizers are made of synthetic fertilizers containing nitrogen and also phosphorus. Here in Florida, we've created these sprawling communities where we have a lot of single-family homes that have lawns, which essentially are a monoculture of turf grass surrounded by impervious surfaces such as roads, parking lots, etc., which makes it so that when people apply the fertilizer to the lawn, it washes off into receiving water bodies or down storm drains, eventually end up in our watershed. Meanwhile, our industrial farming practices are dependent on fertilizer inputs, just due to the degradation of soil health across the entire state. In order to also optimize yields, you need to have this sort of synthetic inputs to kind of create something that actually is profitable as well. So we've seen runoff from these synthetic fertilizers really fueling harmful algae blooms such as red tide and blue-green algae throughout the state. Manure is also a pretty big source of nutrient pollution. Concentrated animal feeding operations are amongst the worst polluters when we're talking about manure from livestock or chicken. Even what's considered also in the Gulf is industrial fish farms, which would also leach more nutrients into our receiving water bodies as well. So when you take all these sources of pollution, and also when we also consider the policy framework we had before you, it really creates a lethal combination that's at the heart of Florida's water quality crisis. Time and time again, we've seen our elected officials, be it the governor or the Florida State Legislature, fail to enact policy that would actually hold polluters accountable, be it agriculture or the fertilizer industry or developers, et cetera, right? They fail to really to provide the proper incentives that would fund local governments, or so they can actually address their leaky water infrastructure, or they also fail to actually hold polluters accountable, so that they can actually begin to address some of these sources of pollution, whether it be through a basin management action plan or through best management practices that are actually enforceable and also have good monitoring systems in place. So basically what you have here, right, is weak, unenforced, or no regulation, in which the polluters, rather than taking care of their own mess, are dumping their pollution and also mess onto our shared waterways and into essentially the public's backyard, right? And basically making the public clean up for their mess with our taxpayer dollars. And this is seen in a variety of situations, such as in the way that wetland developments are permitted, mangrove protections are done, FDP's model urban fertilizer ordinance, or inadequately treated wastewater, inadequately treated biosolids, and also voluntary and also unmonitored agricultural pest management practices, and the ineffective basic management action plans that FDEP has in place as well. I wanted to just kind of do a quick unprotected rural spotlight on FDEP's model fertilizer ordinance. It really sets the bar low when you look at what's actually in place as far as provisions, and also what needs to be done to actually address nutrient pollution. Within FDEP's model fertilizer ordinance, there is no strict rainy season ban on fertilizer containing nitrogen or phosphorus, and it only prohibits application when there is more than 2 inches of rain expected or forecasted, which is impossible to do here in Florida because the weather can be different depending on the day. It also, for the fertilizer free zones, it actually creates these exceptions for where it should be 10 feet, but you can actually apply within 3 feet if you have a deflector shield. Really, which makes it a serious loophole that is impossible to enforce. And people will then say, "Oh, well, I'm fine with a deflector shield," but that still allows fertilizer to get into the adjacent waterway as well. Meanwhile, the certified applicator training that they have associated with this program, called the Green Industry's Best Management Practices, really has this faulty test in place where basically you can pass the training and get every single question related to fertilizer or a lawn and landscape question wrong and still pass the test, actually, right? Because you only need a 75% score in order to be a certified applicator, which means basically you can know nothing about fertilizer and also how it impacts our waterways and still become a certified applicator and apply fertilizer to residents' lawns. And this is seen in various parts of the state. Unfortunately, with the way they've adopted sort of urban fertilizer ordinances. Unfortunately, Collier County, right, has taken that provision as far as not creating a strict rainy season ban to urban fertilizer, and instead just calling on only don't apply fertilizer whenever there's 2 inches of rain. And meanwhile, Orange County has actually created an exemption for certified applicators, basically allowing people who've taken this bogus test and training basically will be allowed to apply fertilizer, despite the fact that this should be unbanned. So, really one of the backbones of water quality protection in Florida over the last 15 years has been the ability of local governments to actually pass stronger urban fertilizer ordinances that go above and beyond the FDP model fertilizer ordinance, right? Since 2017, 15 counties and over 100 municipalities have adopted strong protective urban fertilizer ordinances where you see a strict no rainy season ban on the application of nitrogen and also phosphorus fertilizer. And what we see instead, right, is that there's even some communities like Pinellas and also the city of Tampa that created ordinances that also contain a sales ban on non-compliant fertilizers that contain nitrogen and also phosphorus during the rainy season. However, in response to this, the turf grass and also urban fertilizer industry lobbied the state legislature heavily, creating a statewide law that grants FDACs the exclusive authority to regulate the sale, composition, and distribution of a fertilizer, basically making it so that way it preempts the ability for other local governments and also counties to be able to enact sales bans, and essentially tying the hands of local governments who wish to make stronger urban fertilizer ordinances, that would actually ensure that there's non-compliant products placed on retail shelves. It should be noted, though, that Pinellas and also Tampa were able to be grandfathered in because their ordinances were made in 2011. But still, it's still kind of binding the hands of local governments to be able to actually create more effective fertilizer policy within their own sort of jurisdictions. Conservation and climate change are still, amongst the lowest priorities here in Florida. Quite simply, our leaders are not doing enough to recognize how we can actually address climate change and also human causes stemming from greenhouse gases, as well as doing things that actually would help curb the problem, such as investing in public transit as opposed to more roads, or limiting the creation of new gas plants instead of creating new solar fields. Ultimately, this response to climate change is also going to also compound our water crisis, because warming water temperatures will also create increased severity and also duration for harmful algae blooms in the future as well. In Florida, we see unbridled growth. I mean, if folks have lived in Charlotte County or Lee County or anywhere in Southwest Florida, we know that it looks completely different today than it was 20 or 10 years ago even. Every single day, around 900 to 1,000 people move to Florida. So our state has immense growth challenges. And unfortunately, our leaders are doing nothing to accommodate this growth in a way that would make for smart growth principles. We're not doing things that would actually encourage, high density compact developments. Instead, we're actually permitting projects that create low density sprawl, which see more and more impervious surfaces of roads, and also accompanied by turf grass as well. Really oftentimes in these subdivisions that used to be wetlands oftentimes, right? And what we're seeing is that we're actually adding more and more sources of pollution that can be more difficult to manage, and we don't have the infrastructure related to wastewater treatment facilities to handle this influx of folks in Florida, which is going to create some serious challenges for us to be able to manage this pollution in the years to come if we don't figure out how to get Florida's growth problem under control, and also how to actually create more sustainable communities in the future. And still to this very day, the Everglades have not been completely restored. Completing the series of identified comprehensive Everglades restoration projects, otherwise known as SERPs, needs to be one of the highest priorities if we're indeed going to send more water south. Buying land from Big Sugar in the Everglades agriculture area will go a long way to aiding the cause to send more water south. We actually want to actually have better flow to Florida Bay. We need to be able to do that. And to this point, Big Sugar has not been willing to sell the land despite repeated attempts to buy it. One issue that actually is overlooked but is still a significant source of nutrient pollution in our waterways, especially in a place like Lake Okeechobee, is the practice of aquatic herbicide spraying. So if you didn't know this already, but FWC, the water management districts, Army Corps of Engineers, and even local governments will routinely spray aquatic herbicides onto invasive vegetation to manage it, so it doesn't overpopulate our waterways. So think about things such as like water hyacinth, hydrilla, etc. Right? They'll spray these, and basically what it does, it creates the deposition of this vegetative matter into our water bodies. It's basically this dead aquatic flora. What it basically will release nitrogen, also phosphorus pollution into the water column, which really is no different than depositing grass clippings down the storm drain into the water from the shoreline or into your canals. So the solution to this, right, is that we need to invest our infrastructure to adopt mechanical harvesting practices to manage this aquatic vegetation, so that we can address the source of pollution from being re-released into the water column. Otherwise, if we just let it decay in the water column, it will create more sources of pollution and will only compound the problem afterwards. So obviously, this has been an issue that's been in the headlines quite a bit this summer, related to phosphate mining and also the Piney Point disaster this summer. Obviously in Florida, we have more phosphate mines than anywhere in the country. We have more fossil gypsum stacks than anywhere in the country as well. We saw, with the Piney Point disaster, which was, abandoned phosphate facility, we saw really within 8 days release of over 225 million gallons of slightly radioactive water laden with nutrients into Tampa Bay, right? And, according to the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, that's over 200 tons of nitrogen, which is roughly about 100,000 bags of fertilizer being dumped basically into the bay all at once. This really exacerbated this red tide bloom, and we saw massive fish kills, across the board. And really, it also devastated a lot of the seagrasses within Tampa and Sarasota Bay, reversing a lot of the 15 years of progress that have been made on restoration and also water quality. This is really just another example of FDEP's failure to make sure that, that this hazardous site was in compliance and there wasn't any issue with the site. This could have been prevented had there been more oversight, and really to clear that we need to close down hazardous sites such as Piney Point so we can actually avoid having repeats of this disaster in the future. So the state's approach to red tide involves the regular use of a most insidious red herring. A red herring, for those of you who don't know, may have some sort of kernel of truth, but it is used as a distraction to keep our eyes on less important matters and off the actual bottom line. So the distraction actually outweighs actually the small kernel of truth. So whenever we say red tide is naturally occurring, is a red herring. So when anyone, especially our state representatives or decision makers, say that red tide is naturally occurring, it's a dangerous and disingenuous narrative that only works to shield polluters from being held accountable. So I would love to see if anyone is able to venture some sort of guess, but does anyone have any guess on what rats, E. coli, sexually transmitted diseases, cyanobacteria, and Corynne brevis have in common? Anyone?
They make us sick.
That's true. They make us sick. That's a good one. That's good, Barbara. Anyone else? Well, if not, go ahead, David. Yep.
Yeah, they multiply rapidly.
They multiply rapidly. That's also a good one. David. That's actually one of the best answers I've ever received, actually. So I'm gonna give you like half a point for that one, because I think that's pretty good. Well, anyway, so we're gonna find out here in a moment. But as you might know, right, anytime you read an article in the newspaper, right, you'll always hear that red tide is constantly referred to as naturally occurring because supposedly it's been reported since Spanish explorer days, right, since the times of Juan Ponce de Leon, right. But the question is it customary to use this term for rats, E. coli, or sexually transmitted diseases, or even blue-green algae? They too have also been around since Spanish explorer times. So, rats are obviously naturally occurring, and as David said, they multiply rapidly, right? But we don't dump garbage in the street because we know that if we do dump garbage in the street, we'll get rats, right? So instead we focus on prevention, right? If you make garbage, you pay for its removal through a system provided by the government. Simple, right? We clean up our mess. E. coli is also naturally occurring, but do we say don't bother washing your hands? We can battle the symptoms after people get sick? Of course not. That would be hazardous to public health and much more expensive than prevention, which is why we have signs saying like employees must wash your hands before returning to work. And also why we actually do these things out of just customary habit to one another. And then we don't also say that sexually transmitted diseases are naturally occurring. Instead, we promote safe sex practices. And I really think for this one, there's no further explanation necessary either. So why do we use it for red tide then, right? It creates and perpetuates a false narrative that takes attention away from the only real solution, which is stopping the nutrient pollution that increases the frequency, intensity, and duration of Corynne brevis blooms and also blue-green algae. Whenever people say that red tide is naturally occurring, especially when it's decision makers or elected officials, it's a PR move pushed by polluters and those who protect them. And why? Because stopping pollution at its source through pollution prevention and through source control is paid for by polluter. It essentially affects their bottom line. So calling red tide naturally occurring is completely disingenuous and irresponsible. And this leads to taxpayers like you and I being left with a cleanup bill for all the nutrient pollution statewide, not just on the coast, and also avoiding any sort of regulatory action statewide, spending more money on control and mitigation research rather than prevention strategy research statewide. It also gives decision makers a science-based, quasi-science-based excuse to ignore prevention strategies, not just for red tide, but for all toxic and also nuisance algae. So at this point in time in the presentation, you're probably wondering, oh my gosh, what can we do? This is such a huge issue. And it is a huge issue, right? This is an issue of statewide concern, which is why, it's so important for each of us to really be in contact with our elected officials so they can support legislation that actually stops nutrient pollution at its source, right? And if there's any issue that should cut across the aisle, it should be water issues. I'm here in Florida, right? If we're actually ever going to reduce the incidence of red tide, blue-green algae, and also other algae blooms along Florida's coast and also in our inland waters, we need policies that stop nutrient pollution at its source, whether it be for fertilizer, for sewage, for manure, biosolids, phosphate mining, or aquatic herbicide spraying, right? That means we can't allow our politicians to kind of get away with saying, oh, I'm going to go and try and pursue control mitigation research or innovative technologies or monitoring studies. None of that is actually going to address the problem, right? We need policies to actually address nutrient pollution at source. If you do live on a septic tank, I would encourage you definitely to get that inspected regularly. That's actually one of the recommendations from Governor DeSantis's blue-green algae task force. which was a scientific body that was convened, and really it's called to actually have an overhaul on having septic systems inspected regularly. So definitely would encourage you to do that if you're able to. And also really organizing your own community, right? Obviously it's great when you have civic groups like the Northport Conservancy come together and helping to protect land at a local level. But, it's also good to kind of engage other folks in your community as well and try and tackle local water quality issues that might pertain to your own community. And really just speak up and challenge anyone who uses this entire naturally occurring moniker for describing red tide or other harmful algae blooms. Write a letter to the editor, right? If you see an article within the paper that makes this claim that red tide is naturally occurring at been around since times of Spanish explorers, challenge it, right? And if you call it the article and you submit a letter to the Charlotte Sun, I guarantee it'll be published, because they always love writing. They always like publishing letters related to red tide. Or even if you want to go the extra distance, you can always write an opinion column as well with an op-ed. So yeah, just encourage everyone to always call. Whenever everyone says like something like is naturally occurring, that really is something that is shielding polluters and is actually avoiding accountability. So just be sure to call a red herring when you see it. The other thing that you all can do, right, is follow your own local urban fertilizer ordinance. We're pretty lucky here on the Gulf Coast, with the exception of Collier County and also Hillsborough County, to actually have strict rainy season bans on urban fertilizer for nitrogen and also phosphorus. So Charlotte County has one, Sarasota County has this in place, Lee County has this in place, right? So make sure you educate your neighbors and also HOA if you're a part of one, to make sure that they understand that anytime you apply fertilizer containing nitrogen or phosphorus during the summer months, it's going to end up in our watershed. It's going to end up in the bay, and it's going to contribute to fueling harmful algae blooms. And really the next best thing you can do, right, so you can actually have less dependence on fertilizer even during the non-rainy months, is to use native landscaping, right? These things actually have evolved in this climate and are natural, endemic to this region. And that will also reduce the amount of water you use on your lawn and also in your landscaping as well. So those are things I definitely would encourage you all to do. And at this point, Tim, I'd love to be able to just take any questions that folks might have related to this presentation, other things that they can do to organize in their communities and also to stop nutrient pollution at its source.